So, Your Excellency, my Lord Bishop, we're still waiting for the Archbishop, and so Vice Chancellor, we're also waiting for. So Chair of the Board, so that's why I wanted to come in simple clergyman, and I was advised to come in this, and I knew I would fight against the wind and the air all the time. In the case of Pope Francis, sometimes it covers the whole face. And in any case, so I like, since we've been led through the list of invited guests here twice, I like to follow the bad, lazy West African tradition and say all protocol observed. And so then pursue. So all of you, the distinguished invited guests, I'd like to thank the President and the Board of Hakima University College for their invitation to pronounce the inaugural lecture for this 41st academic year of this institute. Even if for me, like several others living in places like Rome and all, the period of August, the body goes into a low-down mood. Everybody feeling like they're on vacation. And then when you have to embrace an assignment like this, you have to struggle moving out of vacation mood into getting serious about something useful to say. All this notwithstanding, I feel honored to start you all off in this new academic year with a reflection on reimagining power dynamics in the ecclesial and sociopolitical loci, the lessons of Vatican Council II, the lessons of Ecclesia in Africa, and the lessons of the ongoing synod on synodality. And before I begin, let me observe something interesting, not to be personal with you, Father, but I think it's something that probably anybody who picks stuff will also recognize. You know, if I were a student of Hakima, and if I had your president or as a teacher, I'll never worry about the examinations because he gives the answer before he puts the question. And that's what Father Marcel did. His invitation to me provided the answer before he formulated the topic to come and address. So, a student cannot have a better teacher. In exams, you know that he'll provide the answer before he formulates the question. So you just look for whatever he said before he puts the question. In all of this, I just like to observe that the suggestion is, for me this afternoon, in view of Hakima's mandate to pursue and engage in contextual sociopolitical theology and peace studies to accomplish the sanctuary street interconnectedness, invitations to consider a contextual medium or span of significant events in the Church, Vatican Council, Ecclesia in Africa, and an ongoing synod on synodality, and to try to discern or identify how they suggest new approaches to building a church and a society of integral communion, in which all belong and all contribute their spirit-endowed charisms. So, my dear friends, the mere talk about power, because that is a theme, reimagining power dynamics, and then looking at the lessons of the Second Vatican Council, the Church in Africa, and the ongoing synod. Again, as I said, Father gave a little bit of the Second Vatican term in his introductory address, which is very much in consonance with what I just said. He formulates a bit of the answer before the question comes. So he did a little bit of that also for us. Now it is therefore, for me, power dynamics we can understand and talk about in so very many different ways. We can think about the social institutions that we call governance and governments in our part of the world, their impact on populations, civil society, and lifestyles. We can think about the traditional patriarchy or patriarchal society and how it enshrines dominance over, if you want, females and women. One may think about the techno-economic cyber power and the big divide that is establishes between the North and the South. We can think about clericalism in church leadership, influence over children related with the sex abuse scandal. And when recently political figures in the US House of Representative elections lost their votes, a lot of media practitioners hazarded explanations being the fact that because they had been foremost in the protests, recent protests in support of Palestine, the Jewish lobby in the United States has brought them all down. And recently, you have heard about the resignation of two presidents of American universities, whose resignations are also related with the same manifestations and design. So, attribution of use of power in several situations, these are not new and these are not rare. We can read about them all the time. The ongoing sanction under which Russia lives is usually attributed again to American influence on the European Union to have them all adopt a position against Russia. And Russia's own threat has been its possession of nuclear weapons, which has also become a source of power. So you talk about power. You can formulate and find it in almost every angle and how it influences and affects human life. By contrast, we have all of this. But what I'd like then this afternoon to do is look at precisely what the topic invites me to do. What are the lessons from the Second Vatican Council, from the African Synod, and the Synod on Synodality for reimagining or rethinking power dynamics in the church and in society these days? Namely, how and what does Vatican Council II, the African Synod, the first one, and the Synod on Solidarity teach us or show about reimagining power dynamics in church and socio-political situations? In other words, how and what contributions have the Second Vatican Council, the African Synod, and the Synod on Solidarity made towards a renewal of traditional or past teaching or practices with regard to, for example, church-state relationship, or the dyad of sacred power and political power, and so on. So this is what I'd like to discuss with you this afternoon briefly, and I hope I will not bore you stiff, trusting that you had a very good lunch and have stamina to sit in here for a while. So I'd like to start with the Second Vatican Council. What lessons can we draw from the Second Vatican Council by way of dealing with this topic of reimagining power dynamics and structures in society in view of renewal, helping the church and structures in society rethink their position and adapting stances in response to unchanging conditions in society? So, my dear friends, you know that the Second Vatican Council began 1962-1965, held under two popes, Pope John the 23rd and Pope Paul the 6th. and that it was an exercise of aggiornamento, renewal. A renewal, or sometimes even what people call progressive updating of the church. The church emerged, as it were, described as a communion of God's people, engendered by the apostolic proclamation of the message of salvation, centered on the Word of God, and nourished by the Eucharist for a life of service in the church and in society. It involved, therefore, a renewed theology of the church as a communion of God's people, an extensive reform of the liturgy, of revelation, of the laity, and new approaches to relations between the church and the world, ecumenism, and even non-Christian religions, and a big emphasis on the teaching on religious freedom as an expression of human dignity. So the council before the councils, so, Father Marcel gave us a list of features of Vatican II, and he drew attention to the fact that there was no anathema sit in the Second Vatican Council. So it is in the past, in the previous councils, you were want to read stuff about anathema sits. Basically because the previous councils had all been provoked by some doctrinal or theological challenge or question, which they were trying to solve. And so the solution included some formulation like that, not the Second Vatican Council. The Second Vatican Council was not occasioned by a theological debate or uncertainty or a call into question of some doctrinal position of one form or the other. It was not like the Council of Nicaea, 325, which was occasioned by the thing about Arianism. It was not like the Council of Ephesus in 431, which was provoked by a question about the humanity of Jesus, which led to the expression of Theotokos, Mary giving birth to Jesus. It was also like the Council of Chalcedon, 451, which had a challenge and discussion about the nature of Jesus, the dual nature, human, divine. Neither was it like even the Vatican Council, First Vatican Council of 1869, which was about the issue of modernity, and so on. The Second Vatican Council was occasioned simply by the very nature and the mission of the church, the desire to do an overhaul of the nature and the mission of the church, to find how we can improve upon this and do this better. So it didn't mean to settle any doctrinal issue. It meant to take a serious and sincere look at the church and how it was carrying out its vision, and to see how it can improve upon it. And all of this in a changing world. And it's good to keep this in mind. Everything in a changing world. Accordingly, when 3 years into his pontificate, Pope John the 23rd, with his look focused on the needs of the church and the world, set with a humble resolve of initiative on the great task which he felt was divine will, he wanted a pastoral council and a pastoral council of renovation. A pastoral council and a council of renovation. And so in his first encyclical letter, Ad Petri Cathedram of 1959, Pope John Paul II stressed that the council was meant primarily to promote the increasing of faith, the renewal of traditions, and the updating of ecclesiastic discipline. It was meant to witness to truth, unity, and charity in the church. And it was to be an invitation to the unity that Christ wanted for his church. And so, in the meeting of the Preparatory Commission of June 30, 1959, the Pope repeated that the council is convoked first of all because the Catholic Church proposes to attain a new vigor for its divine mission, perennially faithful to the sacred principles on which it stands and to the immutable doctrine entrusted by the divine founder. The Church, always following the footprints of ancient tradition, and on the ancient tradition you can think about the Council of Jerusalem. On this basis, it seeks to strengthen life and cohesion in the face of the many daily contingencies and changing situations in the Church. And it will establish efficient norms of conduct and activity. Therefore, in front of the whole world, it will appear in its splendor. This was John the 23rd's vision of a church as an instrument of salvation in a changing world. So, two words appear to dominate the discourses that led to and accompanied the holding of the Second Vatican Council: pastoral and truth. Pope John the 23rd wanted the council to speak with the voice of pastoral charity, its teaching on many questions which at the present occupy the conscience and the activity of the human person. But pastoral, in the mind of Pope John the 23rd, did not restrict itself to something merely practical, separated from doctrine. The Pope's talk about pastoral did not set an opposition between practical or practice and doctrinal issues. Rather, the pastorality, if you want, of the Second Vatican Council consists in studying and deepening the doctrine and expressing in a way in which it can be better understood, accepted, and loved. And so for John the 23rd, it is only when we have reached the truth that comes from the gospel and which must be translated into the practice of life can our souls relish the tranquil possession of peace and joy. So pastoralizing, as it were, the truth about many questions which at the present occupy the conscience and the activity of the human person, and making it better understood, accepted, and loved, was John the 23rd's vision for convoking or wanting to hold an ecumenical council, a council of aggiornamento in the church. And so when he broached the idea, this is what he did. He opened the window and then said, I want to throw open the windows of the church so that the church can see the world outside, and so that the world outside can also see into the church. This is John the 23rd signal for the aggiornamento. Open the windows so the church can see the world outside, and enable the world outside to also see into the church. This is how engagement, if you want, begins. Or if later on we'll be talking about dialogue, that's also how it begins. And what does it mean to throw open the windows? John the 23rd wanted to throw open the church so that we can see out. Seeing those who are out there, Catholics can learn about them, and discovering their needs really serve them. While therefore the world was to be fled from in the past, now a humbler attitude of service and accompaniment marked the church's position towards the world outside. It's not a feeling of holiness against a sinful world, but it's now a culture of engagement, as it were, with the church to try to know what the church is and work with it. Concretely then, this new posture of the church led to new structures of dialogue in the church. For example, the creation of a dicastery for interreligious dialogue. That it was a fruit of this council. The dicastery for Christian unity, to follow ecumenical questions or issues. That was also a fruit of this council. And not only with groups of religion, but also social issues. And that was the Council for Justice and Peace, which was meant to follow and pursue social relations with the world. So it will include every aspiration and expression of the human person and his spirit. For, again, giving witness and voice to the faith of the whole people of God, gathered together by Christ, this council can provide no better eloquent proof of solidarity with it, as well as its respect and love for the entire human family with which it is bound up than by engaging with it in conversation about all its various problems. For the human person deserves to be preserved. Human society deserves to be renewed. And hence, the focal point of our total presentation will be the human person himself or itself, whole and entire, body and soul, heart and conscience, mind and will. You read about this in Gaudium et Spes. So, this new spirit of engagement, which will characterize the Second Vatican Council attitude towards, I think we ought to pause, and the Archbishop will welcome you. So, Archbishop, I presume your permission to stand out here to confuse people. So, you're heartily welcome. You duly acknowledge and your presence was announced. So engagement has been a big thing now. I'm not here to talk about our dicastery, which would have enabled me to go along the path of how subsequently we have applied this same methodology or this same insight of the Second Vatican Council in a lot of things. In the Dicastery for Justice and Peace and Integral Human Development, there began a series of meetings between mining companies and the Vatican groups about how mining companies and communities can work peacefully. We received the CEO of oil and gas companies, ExxonMobil, Total, Elf Total, BP, Eni, and all of this in conversation about energy transition. We received CEOs of banking companies to come talk about banking for the common good. All in pursuit of this initiative launched by the Second Vatican Council about engagement with the world. And so what we did also, especially when in the United States and elsewhere in Europe, religious congregations were thinking about divesting their investment from oil and gas companies because of pollution and stuff they cause. It was our attempt then to also encourage this religious congregation, do not divest, engage. When you engage a company, you enable a company to share your views, to see how you think, and then also convince them. When you divest, you throw them aside, and there's no dialogue, and there's no way you can change anybody's mind and opinion. So engagement started by the Second Vatican Council signaled a lot of approaches of relationship between church institutions and the world out there, not only ecumenism, dialogue and all, but even with the world of business and society. Second thing Pope John Paul II wanted to do was that people can see into the church. It's not only the church that sees the world outside, but Pope John XXIII wanted the church, people to also see into the church. And so through open windows, dialogue is more likely to happen. This willingness to engage in dialogue represented another important change in the church, and church's stance towards the outside world. And when sometimes the world outside has been slow to see into the church, we've had situations where church leaders have actually promoted and invited groups outside to see into the church. An instance that comes up was the visit. Thank you. So an instance was when Pope Paul VI visited Uganda. When Paul VI visited Uganda in 1969 and had a chance to address the Ugandan parliament, the diplomats and politicians, Pope Paul VI said this: "Gentlemen, it may be well to begin by introducing each other, you to us and we to you. Who are we?" Then he goes on, "You are not perhaps led astray by the opinion held of us by certain contemporaries. We avail ourselves of this opportunity also to declare to you what the Catholic Church does and does not do, to enable you to understand and have a better understanding of the Catholic Church, and to be able to understand its mission in society." And then it begins. "She has no temporal interest of her own. She does not engage in politics in the proper sense of the term, nor does she intend, while performing her mission, to impose particular traits of so-called Western culture at the expense of the good human characteristics of African cultures. Have no fear of the church. She honors you. She educates honest and loyal citizens for you. She does not foment rivalries and division. She only seeks to promote healthy liberty, social justice, and peace. And if there's one thing that the church desires most, which is not really its desire, but your desire, it is the thing about development." It is from there that Pope Paul VI will give a new definition of peace and say, development is the new name of peace. And that if development is the new name of peace, then peace, or for development to take place, we also need peace. So this is John Paul II, Pope John the 23rd. So when Pope John the 23rd spoke of the windows of the church, he obviously meant that the whole church, not only the Vatican, but the whole church, with its bishops and laity all over the world. Apart from this imagery of opening windows to fashion an engagement and communication dialogue between the church and the world and society and the different churches, another image that accompanied the Second Vatican Council was the image and the principle of dynamic fidelity. Because opening windows so that the church can see out and so that people can see in the church was not only an expression of a pastoral vision of a pope, namely the mission of a church that goes out, Chiesa in Uscita, a church that goes out to the peripheries, but it also entailed the church's offer of her treasures in the ensuing engagement to the world in changing situations. So it entailed the affirmation of the church's identity and nature before and in a world with which she was now engaged in dialogue. It entailed in essence an exercise of the church's affirmation of her fidelity to her identity. Thus, another telling image which is very much associated with the Second Vatican Council and its expression of the church's fidelity to her identity is a passage in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 5, which says that no one puts new wine into an old wineskin. If he does, the new wine will burst the skin and it will be spilled, and the skin will be destroyed. But new wine must be put into fresh wineskin, and no one after drinking old wine desires new, for he says the old is good. The two sayings are not contradictory, nor is it not simply a matter of preferring one and rejecting the other. New versus old is not a firm opposition between elements. Instead, the two sayings are wisely complementary. Jesus' teaching invites discernment of what is appropriate at each stage or circumstance, and the council captured this in its proceedings. Some indeed might think that a pope who opens windows to opt heavily for new wine and fresh wineskin. But in his opening speech, Pope John the 23rd said that the council wishes to transmit pure and integral, without any attenuation or distortion, the doctrine of the church. Yet, that doesn't mean that he was opting exclusively for old wine or old wineskin, for he went on to spell out the two duties of the council. Not only to guard this precious treasure, as if we were concerned only with antiquity, but to dedicate ourselves with an earnest will and without fear to that work which our era demands of us. You preserve something, but you recognize also what the era and your times demand of you, namely the progressive updating of the church before the changing situations of the human person and his world, which involve the church in a dynamic fidelity to the gospel. And what does this all mean for us? From the church of the Second Vatican Council, the institution that serves salvation of the human person in changing times displays the attribute of living both faithfully to the gospel and dynamically, responding authentically to the world around her. The church lives through changes in history and in situations which affirm her identity rather than diminish or interrupt it. Therefore, the dogmatic constitution of the church, Lumen Gentium, affirms the following. The church, both before and after the council, was and is the same church, one holy Catholic and apostolic, journeying on through time and history. She continues her pilgrimage among the persecutions of the world and the consolations of God, proclaiming the death of the Lord until he comes. And when the church has reviewed or even corrected certain historical decisions and this apparent discontinuity, it has actually preserved and deepened her inmost nature and true identity. Scholars who have followed this path of thinking and sought to develop this image of the challenges of the Aggiornamento of Vatican II have often quoted John Henry Newman and what John Henry Newman had to say about church and growth. But for now, we simply want to probably revert to what Pope Benedict XVI also said. And what he said is something that we can all appreciate. We can all sit in here, look at ourselves, and imagine when we were 3 years old. We didn't have this type of body. We are now grown beard or mustache or whatever. But we bore a name and identity which we continue to bear now, 50 years later. So the dynamic identity that the Popes were talking about is that admitting change and growth, we still maintain an identity which does not change. This is true of the human person, and Benedict says it's true also of the church. We change features, but the true nature of the church doctrine or whatever, that it does not change. So, 40 years later in 2005, Pope Benedict XVI, speaking to members of the Roman Curia about the Second Vatican Council, asserted that the Church increases in time and develops, yet always remains the same, the one subject of the genuine people of God. Indeed, it is precisely in this combination of continuity and discontinuity at different levels, like the integrity of human growth and maturing, that the very nature of true reform consists. It is what Pope Benedict then defined in these terms: a dynamic fidelity is the great cause for the great open-mindedness, but also clear discernment that the world rightly expects of us. As children of the Church, to make this discernment and to make the documents of the Council increasingly powerful for the ever necessary renewal of the Church. And so a personal experience and witness. Shortly after Laudato Si had been published, we were invited to Ottawa, St. Paul's University, and we had to discuss the subject of the dynamics of dynamic growth of faith in the Second Vatican Council. And then the local Archbishop Weisgerber of Winnipeg, helped to situate the question, probably better for all of us, the question of dynamic fidelity. And he says, history tells us that it takes about 100 years for the Church to receive the teaching of a council. It takes about 100 years for a church to receive fully the teaching of a council. And comparing that to the Second Vatican Council, he says, we struggle now to be 50 with the Second Vatican Council. We're still very much in the early days of the Second Vatican Council. Much has been done, but much remains to be done. We need to continue to strive with great energy to implement the vision of the Church given to us by the Second Vatican Council. The gifts, the energy, and the goodwill of all members of our community are needed to build a church of communion, a church that responds to changing times. And so, dear friends, in the resultant 16 documents of the Second Vatican Council, which Pope Benedict XVI referred to as a great fresco, painted with a great multiplicity and variety of its elements under the guidance of the Holy Spirit, the intention or the desire for an aggiornamento of the popes and the council fathers were expressed or captured. And so the mind, the spirit, and the intention of the council of updating the Church in Vatican II are to be found in these 16 documents, in which the Council proposed significant developments in doctrine and practice to enable the Church to be true to her nature and mission in the modern and changing world. Accordingly, when Pope Benedict XVI celebrated the Council when it was 50 years old, he called them a compass in our time that permits the bark of the Church to put out into the deep amidst storms or on calm and peaceful waters, and to sail safely to reach her destination. So this is how Benedict XVI referred to the Second Vatican Council: a compass that guides the Church towards its destination in storm and in calm waters. So this afternoon, at this point, I realize that if I go on like this for all the 3 points you asked me to talk about, we'll be here till midnight, you know? So we need to skip some details. You agree? Say yes. So it is. Therefore, the issue about rethinking power dynamics concretely, to address the issue, is this: So from this hasty overview of the Second Vatican to underline its great attribute of dynamic fidelity within a progressive updating, rethinking, and reformulation of doctrine and discipline to respond to the preaching of the gospel, I'd like now to discuss briefly how the great fresco, which captures the spirit of aggiornamento, according to Pope Benedict XVI, also provides a compass for the exercise of power, for the renewal or the reimagining of power in the church and in society following the Second Vatican Council. And here I'll try to skip. Ultimately, I think you will have all of this in your hands, so you can see something. So, I try to do what somebody with my training would do in such situation when you give us a word. So first thing was I went into all the Vatican documents and see what they say about power and where they occur. And that since the Vatican document, like every document of the church, is preserved in Latin, the document of reference would be in Latin. So I went to the Latin epistles and see how do they present potestas. But we were seeing beginning of how they, and not much. But there is one thing which is common in all the documents: the constitutions, the declarations, and the decrees. Power is there all the time in the concluding expression, where the Pope, at the end of every document, says, "By the power of Christ handed on to me, I declare this document that, and that." That is a consistent use or reference to exercise of power by the Pope in all the documents. And the Pope talks about the power handed on to him, or handed over to him by Christ, and in that power he promulgates all the doctrines of the Second Vatican Council. So this is constant when even the document itself makes no mention of power, the conclusion is always like that. The Pope promulgates the document in his exercise of his apostolic power handed over to him by Christ. So the vocabulary potestas, if you look at the documents, in some places it's translated by authority, in some places translated by jurisdiction, in some places even translated by decisions, so very many whatever. But I decided to simply share this small, since we're talking about power dynamics in church and society, to simply just this glimpse about the church. When the Pope talks about the power handed on to him with which he promulgates every document, it's interesting to note a few things. What kind of power is the Pope exercising in this regard? It is certainly not the power of himself as a bishop, because all the bishops of the council had that power. Every bishop ordained by reason of ordination has this sacred power. So if that was the sense, then the Pope didn't have any special power that the other bishops did not have. So it cannot refer to the power of ordination. Neither can it refer to a power when a decision is taken and hence are imposed on somebody to be sent, like the case of Barnabas or the case of Matthias, who was chosen to replace. The power of the Pope is presented in the documents in this way. It is handed over from Christ. It is exercised together with the venerable fathers of the council, una cum venerabilibus patres. So all the council fathers are involved in the exercise of this power. Then he goes on to say, it is exercised in the Holy Spirit. And then the object of its exercise is what have been synodally established and synodally decided upon. This is the Pope exercising his particular personal privilege and power, but the object of its exercise is what have been synodally established and approved. So what the Pope exercises his power to promulgate is not something that is coming from his own head, but what has been synodally discussed and approved. Synodaliter statuta. Then the goal and the purpose of it is twofold. to serve the true faith of the apostolic mission entrusted by Jesus, and to give glory to God for convoking the synod. So this is the special power that the Pope exercises, which you find in all the documents of the Second Vatican Council. And its exercise is worth noting, especially the part about the object of its exercise is what have been synodally established and approved by the group. So although the power of the Pope, which is referenced at the end of the conciliar documents to approve and to promulgate them, belong to his unique office and ministry as a successor of Peter and the vicar of Christ, its exercise at the Vatican Council itself knows of consultation, discussion, a quest for information, a search for elucidation, and so on. This happened at the first council, if you remember, in Jerusalem, when everybody spoke. It has happened at all synodal and conciliar meetings, and such consultations are not limited to members of the College of Apostles or their bishops, because representatives of local churches, male, female, and the youth, are also there at the synod. Fraternal delegates are also there at the synod. All of this contribute towards this thing which is synodally approved, which the Pope promulgates with his signature and with his power. So it is interesting and it is important to know this. Accordingly, the Pope's privileged power, such as Paul VI exercised at the Council to approve and to promulgate the Council document, is personal power, but not really autocratic. It is exercised synodally in various degrees with all the different people in communion. Synodally in different stages, because those who prepare the documents for the synod, instrumentum laboris, lineamenta, all of this contribute in very many ways, in very many processes towards the synod. And so what we talk about synodally is not just those who come to meet and sit there to discuss this, but everybody who had a role to play in the preparation of the synod and the doctrine are part of this synodal activity whose fruit the Pope ultimately approves. When this is the case, of course, one can also draw attention to a few challenges that can arise. Now the Church from this council is talking with non-Catholics, so ecumenically discussing whatever faithful, and it is important to realize some of the challenges that come from this ecumenism. Later on, I suppose we can talk about it a little bit. Like the Methodist Church, for example. In the Methodist Church, any decision of the president has to be ultimately approved by the whole council, otherwise it doesn't bind, it doesn't apply. That is not the sense in which the Pope exercises his power. It's not in the sense of the president of the Methodist Bishops' Conference and for whatever they have to do. So that's one. It's also not, the synod is also not there for a meeting that people come to in search of a consensus, building a consensus at the end of which the Pope approves. What the Pope approves is not a majority consensus opinion or anything, that's what it is. So that somebody can say that our expressed or whatever is not expressed, so this is not worth the approval of the Pope. So the Pope approves something synodally established, but whatever he approves is not also the fruit of majority consensus at any synod or whatever. It's not a session people come to take vote for a position or against another position. That's not also the nature of a synod. So this explains why the Pope's exercise of this apostolic power handed over by Christ concludes every conciliar document, even when the document does not discuss power, as in Dei Verbo. Apart from these references to papal power to approve the outcome of document, it's interesting, probably for the sake of curiosity, to simply note the following. For example, if we're talking about power and its discussion or use in the conciliar document, when we were able to discover, for example, that in Lumen Gentium, power is used 33 times. And it is to discuss the power of the bishop and how through ordination the bishop shares this power with the priest. The power of delegation and all, and the discussion of that constitute 33% of the use of power in that encyclical. Sacrosanctum Concilium on liturgy talks about power only 4 times and has to do with power of local bishops to sometimes suggest some modification about a point in liturgy. Gaudium et Spes, Church in the Modern World, uses power 14 times, and some of which we shall see briefly after this is the use of power in the relations between church and society and church and governments. Then education uses power only once. Dignitatis Humanae, about human freedom, religious freedom and all, uses power 21 times, talks about power 21 times, and we shall look at it briefly, is the power for a state to affirm the religious freedom of its citizens. Ad gentes 6 times, and so on. So the greatest use of power is being the discussion in Lumen Gentium about how a pope, how a bishop by ordination gets sacred power, and how it can be delegated to priests under certain conditions, and how its exercise needs to consider and respect those type of things. So a big part of it is sacramental power, okay, and its use. Over and above that, another sense in which power is used a lot in the document of the Second Vatican Council, which I'll probably draw attention to, making a big jump and skip, is the power in socio-political spheres, the relationship between church and state, and so on. Skipping, of course, a small, small thing that could also be, one of the big things of the ongoing synod about priestly service, its limitation only to masculine or male, the possibility of extending the power of ordination to women, the gender question, the question of laity, to what extent they may also exercise all of this. These are issues which came up in the synod on the Amazon, and these are issues which have come up in the 2 instances of the synod till now. It's about exercise of power in the church, and the crucial determining discussion is power and its exercise sacramentally a right or a charism? And the discussion between the two is worth doing. If power is right, everybody can claim it. If it's something that is bestowed, then it depends on the one who bestows it. And indeed, in the book of Numbers, that's what is said about the priesthood. God says to Moses, I give you the priesthood as a gift to exercise for the holiness of my people. And then in that sense, the gift of priesthood is something that God bestows on Aaron and his children for the holiness of God's people. Times have changed. Would that involve also a change in that regard? That is a thing for discussion at the synod. Let me quickly look at how much time do I have? So I'll skip a few things. So the exercise of power in the socio-political arena, so between church and state, between church and civil society, is also an issue that the Second Vatican Council also deals with. And it is this. In this, I'm glad to be standing in an audience in a community of Jesuits, because in this I used an article written by one Jesuit, very popular, a lot, one Father MURI, a Jesuit priest from England. His discussion on this has been something that I've referred to a lot. So apparently at the beginning of the Second Vatican Council, there was the plan to study the topic about relationship between church and state. And then they went about formulating drafts to be considered. There, it was difficult to establish unanimity on the draft to be studied. So ultimately, the question about the relations between church and state filtered down into something about the recognition of the dignity of the human person and his freedom. So what the church could have discussed about relationship between church and state became ultimately a discussion about the state's recognition of the dignity of people and the guarantee of their freedom, including religious freedom. So that became the form under which the relation between church and state got discussed at the Second Vatican Council. And that will happen in the document about Dignitatis Humanae and then Gaudium et Spes. This will be the two big areas where this subject matter is taken up and then discussed in detail. I'll be brief in that, simply to say that this involved a lot of change on the part of the Vatican, in a sense. When Pope Leo XIII came out Rerum Novarum, it was considered to be a game changer. It changed a lot of things, got a lot of things on a different track and all of that. But still, Pope Leo was addressing the church, which is essentially in Europe. The Industrial Revolution, the French Revolution, modernism, and all of those things which the document said, and then Industrial Revolution and the poverty among people and the working classes, those issues were all issues of Europe. So Rerum Novarum, for as significant as it was also essentially dealing with European church. Second Vatican Council moves away from that. Second Vatican Council is not dealing with the church in Europe, it's dealing with the church that is not universal. And the sense of the church is not the Catholic Church, but the sense of the church is now the church in communion or in relationship with the Protestant churches and with the Eastern churches and all of those. So, at the Second Vatican Council, a few things of the popes of the past had changed. Changing times had required a lot of changes on the part of the church. And so the talk about the church and its relationship with the state and civil society could not take the form of the days of Leo the Great. Time allowing, I could take a little bit. Now here in Nairobi, you have a little Vatican, so you probably have all kinds of religions. Do you have the Dehonians here? The Dehonian fathers? No? Okay. Father Dehon, the founder of the Dehonians, was the guy whom Leo XIII was sent to promote the diffusion of Rerum Novarum in France among the working classes. Because Father Dehon himself saw that the church has lost its influence both on the poor and on the state, and could not get any position of it accepted. So Dehon started a movement which encouraged the priests to leave their sacristies to go among the poor, the working classes, to try to present to them that the church was still close to them. That kind of movement was picked up in Europe by something that they call the social movements, which became also political parties in some regard. But Pope Leo XIII was always diffident. He was not too convinced about these social movements, which were also becoming political parties. And so it was Dehon who brought this up, and then gradually the thing became the recognition of the dignity of the poor workers, which all owners of property, capitalists and all of that needed to respect. And then on the part of the state, the freedom of such workers to organize themselves into labor groups and to be able to kind of push and fight for their rights. So these new changes will begin to emerge in the Second Vatican Council. So Rerum Novarum has started something, but it's taken a new shape in the Second Vatican Council because the concept of a church has changed, the situation in society has changed, the relationship between church and state has changed, and then the church had given up the power, what they call sacred power, which gave thrones, so states, the responsibility of protecting the church, including doctrine. So at the Second Vatican Council, the state avowed a recognition of the freedom of people, including religious freedom, but not the power to teach religion for the church. So the state was not a protege of religion and faith of the church at the Second Vatican Council. Rather, it decided to appreciate and move for the thing about the state's respect for the dignity of people and their freedom, including religious freedom. So this becomes the thing that characterizes the Second Vatican Council, which Dignitatis Humanae will very much deal with. And so what will be accepted in Dignitatis Humanae by the church would be recognizing that the state-church relationship was to a large extent also the result of historical events and developments. The Second Vatican Council in Dignitatis Humanae was ready to accept this fact, that the state recognizes the freedom of all its citizens, including their religious freedom and their freedom to practice whatever. Now, if for any historical reason the state is bound in a certain way with a particular faith, that faith should still ensure that the other religions have a right to exercise their faith. This is a position that pretty much ties with a whole lot of situations we have in the church in the world these days. If a state, by some historical reasons, is bound with some expression of faith, this is what we have in the Middle East. Okay, historical reason, all the states in whatever in the Arab world so bound with religion. If that's for any event of history, that relationship exists, then the thing is that such governments should still recognize the state of the other non-whatever members to profess and to exercise their faith. This will be the big challenging thing that the Second Vatican Council in Dignitatis Humanae will seek to promote and promulgate. And so, fast tracking a little bit and moving on a little bit. So on the religious freedom, then the council sought to develop the doctrine of the popes, extended by Pius XI and Pius IX and Pius XI, for some historical reasons that they themselves experienced. You know, before Pius IX, the Vatican controlled the city of Rome and had all the estates. Under Pius IX, the Vatican lost its territories and retreated into what we now call the Vatican City-State. So Italy then, under Garibaldi, they made the city of Rome the capital of the Kingdom of Italy. So the Pope withdraws from the city of Rome and enters into the Vatican. And the successor of Pius IX, so Pius X and XI, would then in the Lateran Treaty negotiate with the city of Rome about the respect for the independence of the church and its immunity in pursuing the faith, the Catholic faith all around the world. Things had changed for the church itself. The church was no more the dominant thing in, Rome was not all Catholic and all of that and that. The Catholic Church, the papacy was now limited to the Vatican state. It giving up the city of Rome, was no more in charge and all of that. So things had changed also for the church. And that also occasioned the church also to rethink a whole lot of its positions. And so the Lateran Treaty would be signed to safeguard and guarantee the Republic of Italy's respect for the Vatican autonomy as existing as a state, independent state with its own religious freedom and all. So such historical changes are worth noting, and these happened just before the Second Vatican Council, and it was in this having this as a background. So the long and the short of it is that the challenge between the throne and the altar, which used to be the two states, state and the church, the throne and the altar, the challenge between those, all of these were, as it were, dissolved. And then it became rather the state's recognition of the dignity and the freedom of all members, Christians and civilians. Okay, so it's people of state who are also members of the church. And this became a bigger, put it on the line, the theme of the Second Vatican Council. Now, in terms of this, as a force for rethinking and reimagining things in a changed situation, the Vatican Council having going through this, few things are significant noting. From the days of Leo XIII, they talk about dignity and freedom and all of that. We saw the beginning of what will later on become the doctrine of the social teaching of the church. The principles of the doctrine of the social teaching of the church emerged from this experience, this period from Rerum Novarum on to John Paul II and on. So the question of the dignity of the human person, the human being as a person, with a dignity, with freedom, its relationality, and all of those. They're talking about the common good. They're talking about solidarity. They're talking about subsidiarity, the universal destination of the goods of the earth. All of these principles were beginning to galvanize now, and became principles which will later on be studied. So when after the Second Vatican Council, John Paul I came and quickly went, and so we had John Paul II. John Paul II decided to filter this as a body of principles that will continue to guide rethinking and reconsideration of a lot of events in the church. So John Paul II asked the Council for Justice and Council, Pontifical Council Justice and Peace, to collect all of these principles into a book which Cardinal Vantuan began. He finished it, but did not promulgate it when he died, and Cardinal Martino continued and then began to spread it all around. So the birth of the compendium of the social teaching of the church flows from this experience of the Second Vatican Council. And we have this compendium of the social teaching of the church, which now is used universally to guide a whole lot of reflections in society about a whole lot of things. Second thing Pope John Paul II did is not only the promulgation of the fruit of the Second Vatican Council and the social principles that he took care of. John Paul II also went on to create now, in the Academy of the Sciences, a new branch called the Academy of the Social Sciences. Before the Second Vatican Council, the Academy of the Sciences where I work was only an academy of sciences, which goes back to 1610. Galileo was a member of that in 1610. Marconi followed and all of that. So a very ancient thing from the 17th century, but it was only Academy of the Sciences. Under Pope John Paul II, following the Second Vatican Council, John Paul II thought that the study of these social issues should attain more, some higher consideration. And so he created, or he asked that there be created also an Academy of the Social Sciences together with the Academy of Sciences. So now, if you see reference to what was said here, is that the two academies now exist: Academy of Sciences and Academy of Social Sciences, with the particular task of deepening these principles and their application to situations in society. There'd be a third thing that John Paul II would do. John Paul II, following another trace that was marked out by the Second Vatican Council, will be the beginning of the holding of continental episcopal, continental synods. The continental synods had also been discussed at the Second Vatican Council, and John Paul II will begin implementing them. So from the days of John Paul II, you hear about the Special Assembly of Bishops for Europe, for Middle East. For Africa, we had it once with John Paul II, and Pope Benedict will have a second time, as we would also talk about. So John Paul II, following upon Paul VI concretely, began also introducing or concretizing or establishing some of these things which had been discussed in the Second Vatican Council to guide the ongoing renewal and aggiornamento of the church. So with this, John Paul II Let me briefly mention the second thing that was indicated, the first African Synod or Church Ecclesia, whatever. So, in line with what I've just observed, John Paul II, wanting to follow up on the Second Vatican Council, decided to organize these regional conferences and the regional synods or continental synod, and that of Africa was in 1994. So same month, 1994 compendium, 1994 creation of the Academy of Social Sciences, 1994 the first African Synod. This was particularly for us. So 1994, this African Synod was held in April, Easter season. Therefore, the name that the Synod bore was a Synod of Resurrection. Okay, resurrection of hope and resurrection. But the elements and the details that the Instrumentum Laboris or the Lineamentum all captured was always the challenges of the African continent. Tribalism, ethnicity, corruption, all of those things were captured. So although the Synod was called a Synod of the Resurrection, death to sin, a newness of life and all of that, these challenges were there. And a very cruel reminder of this conflicting situation on the continent was the fact that the Synod began on a very euphoric note, the collapse of the apartheid, 1994. Apartheid collapsed in South Africa, and was a lot of jubilation at the beginning of the Synod. But what happened at the end of the Synod? You know what happened? You remember? What? Yeah. So we started on a euphoric note, but the conclusion was the Rwandan killings and the genocide. If you want, a kind of a symbolic representation of the tensions and the contrarieties that we have on the continent. While we celebrate, we always mourn. So feeling the need for grace, but we also see the face of evil. And this was the nature of the first African Synod. And so when Ecclesia in Africa adopted as its image, for everything, the church family of God. Everybody thought that the image and the attributes of a family can occasion a renewal and a rethinking of relationship and values in the church. Because if you say the church is a family, it's a family first and foremost because God is the Father. And we are children in Jesus, who is the firstborn of very many brothers and sisters. So with the family of this character, God the Father, and all of us brothers and sisters in Jesus, all forming one body, one would have hoped that all the challenges that we had before the Synod will kind of disappear, or even kind of, has it? Difficult. As I stand here, I've gone in two places to try to settle nomination of bishops which were rejected because of ethnic belonging. Church family of God. He's not from here. You heard of it, you know of it, right? So this is the church family of God. And this is after the Synod. So after the Synod, having created an image of church family of God, which was meant to promote communion among all of us, our brothers and sisters, we still have this challenge of ethnicity, tribalism, where one belongs, where one doesn't belong. It's a lot of work still to be done. So the ongoing reimaginings, whatever type of religion, is still on and it's still unset. So some of us thought happily that it was great that 15 years after the First Vatican Council, first Synod on Africa, with this challenging situation, that Pope Benedict XVI probably also tweeted something. So he decided to call for a second African Synod. And when he called for the second African Synod, this time the thing was not church family of God. We fought that. But how were we able to live as a family in this church? And so the second African Synod says, this is possible only if we are We live as salt and light of the world. 7, reconciliation, justice, and peace. If we are servants or makers of peace, reconciliation, and peace, we can probably then succeed in this. So the Second African Synod came out with a document called Afriche Munus, right? The task that we have before us as a church in Africa. And Afriche Munus, if you wanted, then gave us the ingredient with which we can actually undertake to live as church family of God. All the challenges that we needed still to address. This was also the thing that we have to deal with. And so the team, Church Family of God, and then the need to face all of these challenges to make them real, and try to rethink church in that light. It's also something that goes on to, that flows into the present synod that is being celebrated. Here in this environment, a group of you got together and prepared a small document to accompany those who are following the new synod. And so, instead of Church Family of God, some of the writers began to use the word Ujama. Okay? It's the same family, right? Probably the same family. But, so that's the thing. If you could not live Church Family of God, can you now live Church Ujama, God? But the challenge is always on. So this synod that is ongoing invites us to the same values, to live as communion. Learn to live a mutuality of life. All having charisms which we can share with one another. Paul tells us this in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. We all have charisms with which we come to build up the church. With the charism that Paul talks about, we don't have the charism to break up the church. We have the charism to build up the church. So it's in the mutuality of the exercise of our charisms that we build up the church. That's what this synod is all about. And so communion, building up the church, the mutual exercise of our charisms, we come again to this, to seek to rethink and review each other and then have a church pursue its project of our adjournamento. So my dear friends, I know I've exceeded the time that was allotted to me. And so I wouldn't want to abuse your patience further. I wish to release you from this bondage in which I've kept you so far. And so with this, we want to thank you for your attention, and then hope that I've been able to share some thoughts with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Eminence, for your great speech. At this juncture, we have the interaction session, but due to time, we are going to accept only 2 questions, please. And when you come forward, you have to be precise and straight to the point. No preamble, please. Precise and straight to the point in order to ensure